The morning sun rose slowly over Haven's Rest, painting the green hills in golden light. The small farming colony looked peaceful as always, with white houses scattered across the valley like toys in a giant's playground. Smoke drifted up from breakfast fires while farmers headed out to tend their crops. Children played in the yards before school started. It was the kind of quiet morning that made people forget there were wars happening in distant parts of the galaxy. Captain Jake Morrison stood on the porch of the security station, drinking coffee from a chipped blue mug. He watched the colonists go about their daily routines and felt satisfied with the peaceful life they had built here. Jake was a big man with graying hair and kind eyes, who had come to Haven's Rest 5 years ago, looking for a quiet place to retire from military service. The worst trouble he had dealt with since arriving was helping Mrs. Patterson find her escaped chickens. Down the street, Dr. Lisa Bennett was already at work in the small medical clinic. She had been on Haven's Rest for 3 years and loved the simple life of treating scraped knees and helping with difficult births. Lisa was a young woman with brown hair always pulled back in a practical ponytail. She had left her job at a big city hospital to find a place where medicine felt more personal and meaningful. The colony had about 200 people living in it. Most were farmers who had come looking for fresh soil and clean air. Some were retired folks who wanted peace and quiet. A few were people like Jake who had seen enough of the galaxy's troubles and just wanted to tend a garden and watch sunsets. They grew corn and wheat and raised cattle in the wide green pastures. It was an honest life that made people sleep well. At night, Amy Cooper was hanging laundry behind her small house when the sky began to change. She was a pretty woman with blonde hair and work-worn hands who had come to Haven's Rest with her husband 2 years ago. Their 8-year-old son Danny was playing nearby, making spaceship sounds as he ran around the yard with his arms spread wide like wings. The first sign of trouble was a distant rumble that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Amy stopped, hanging clothes, and looked up at the sky. The morning had been clear, but now dark clouds were rolling in from the eastern mountains. Lightning flickered inside the clouds, but it looked wrong somehow. The light was too bright, and the wrong color. Danny stopped running and pointed at the sky. "Mama, look at the pretty lights." Amy felt a chill that had nothing to do with the wind. She had lived on frontier worlds before, and knew the difference between a natural storm and something else. "Danny, come inside, right now." The rumble grew, louder, and now they could see something falling through the clouds. It was not rain or hail. It was something big and dark that left a trail of fire behind it as it fell toward the mountains. Jake heard the noise and stepped off his porch to get a better look. Other colonists were coming out of their houses and shops, all staring at the eastern sky. The falling object hit the mountainside with a crash that shook the ground and rattled windows throughout the valley. A column of black smoke rose from where it had landed. That was no meteor, Jake said to himself. He went back inside and grabbed his emergency radio. "All security personnel report to the station immediately. We have a situation." Dr. Bennett heard the crash from her clinic and looked out the window. She had seen enough ship crashes during her time on frontier worlds to recognize one. Someone or something had just gone down in the mountains, and they might need medical help. She began gathering her emergency supplies. The storm that followed was unlike anything the colonists had ever seen. Wind howled down from the mountains carrying strange smells of burned metal and something else they could not identify. Rain fell in heavy sheets that seemed to glow faintly in the dim light. Lightning struck the ground again and again, each bolt seeming to search for something. Jake and his 4 security officers met at the station while the storm raged outside. They were all good men who had signed up to help keep the peace in a quiet farming community. None of them were prepared for whatever had just crashed in their mountains. "Should we send a team up to investigate?" asked Officer Pete Warren, a young man who had joined the security force just 6 months ago. Jake looked out at the violent storm. "Not in this weather. We wait until it passes, then we go take a look. Could be survivors who need help." The storm lasted 3 hours. When it finally ended, an unnatural quiet fell over the valley. The usual sounds of birds and insects were gone. Even the wind had stopped completely. The silence felt heavy and wrong, like the air before an earthquake. Jake led his team toward the mountains as soon as the roads were passable. They took the colony's only vehicle, a sturdy truck designed for rough terrain. The crash site was about 10 miles from the settlement, up a winding mountain road that had been cut by the early colonists. What they found made Jake wish he had brought more men. The crashed ship was huge, easily 3 times the size of anything that usually visited Haven's Rest. It was built like a fortress with thick armor plating and weapon ports along its sides. This was not a passenger ship or a cargo hauler. This was something military, and it looked like it had been designed to transport very dangerous cargo. The ship had torn a long gash in the mountainside when it crashed. Trees were flattened for hundreds of yards around the impact site. The hull was cracked open like an egg, and strange green fluid was leaking from the breach. The air around the ship shimmered with heat, and there was a smell like burning sulfur mixed with something organic and rotten. "Stay back," Jake ordered his men. "We don't know what kind of radiation or chemicals might be leaking from that thing." Officer Warren pointed at the ship's markings. "Captain, look at those symbols. I think this is a prison transport." Jake studied the alien writing on the hull and felt his blood go cold. He had seen those symbols before during his military service. They marked ships that carried the galaxy's most dangerous criminals and creatures, things so deadly that they could not be kept on regular prison worlds. A sound came from inside the broken ship. It was low and rumbling like the growl of some enormous animal. The men all took a step back and reached for their weapons. "What do you think was in there?" whispered another officer. Before Jake could answer, something moved in the shadows inside the ship. Something big. They caught a glimpse of what looked like massive claws scraping against metal, and then silence fell again. "We're going back to town," Jake said quietly. Right now, they drove back to Haven's Rest as fast as the mountain road would allow. Jake's mind was racing as he tried to remember everything he knew about prison transports. Whatever had been locked up in that ship was now free, and it was only 10 miles from a colony full of families and children. Back at the settlement, life was returning to normal after the storm. Amy Cooper was making lunch while Danny played with his toy spaceship at the kitchen table. Dr. Bennett was treating a farmer who had been hit by a piece of flying debris. Most of the colonists were cleaning up storm damage and didn't know that their quiet world was about to change forever. Jake called an emergency meeting at the community center. When the colonists saw his grim face, the cheerful chatter died away. They could tell something was very wrong. "Folks," Jake began, "we've got a problem. That thing that crashed in the mountains was a prison transport. We don't know what was inside, but it's loose now." The room erupted in worried voices. Parents pulled their children closer. The older colonists who had lived through frontier troubles before began asking practical questions about defenses and evacuation. Dr. Bennett raised her hand for quiet. "What exactly are we dealing with, Jake?" "I don't know yet," he admitted. "But prison transports only carry things too dangerous for regular lockup. We need to assume the worst and prepare accordingly." As if summoned by his words, a new sound drifted down from the mountains. It was a howl that seemed to come from no earthly throat, long and wild and full of hunger. The sound made everyone in the room go quiet and still. Danny Cooper looked up from his toy spaceship and listened to the strange howl with the curiosity of a child who had never learned to be afraid of new things. "What kind of animal makes that sound, Mama?" he asked. Amy held him tighter and wished she knew the answer. The first attack came at sunset. Jake was setting up a patrol schedule when Officer Warren burst through the door of the security station. His face was white with terror, and his hands were shaking so badly he could barely hold his radio. "Captain, you need to come quick. The Henderson farm, something terrible happened." They drove out to the Henderson place in the last light of day. The farm sat at the edge of the colony, where the cultivated fields met the wild grasslands. It had been a peaceful spot where old Bill Henderson raised his sheep and enjoyed his retirement. The farmhouse was still standing, but the front wall had been torn open like paper. Claw marks as long as a man's arm were gouged deep into the wooden walls. The sheep pen had been destroyed completely, and the animals were gone. Not eaten, Jake realized as he looked at the scene. Just gone, as if something had taken them for sport. Bill Henderson was found in his barn, alive but badly hurt. His arm was broken and he had deep scratches across his chest. Dr. Bennett arrived quickly and began treating his wounds while Jake questioned him. It was huge, Bill whispered, his voice hoarse with pain and fear. 12 feet tall, maybe more, black as midnight with scales like armor, eyes that glowed red in the dark. It moved so fast I barely saw it coming. What did it want? Jake asked. Nothing. It just played with me, like a cat playing with a mouse. It could have killed me easy, but it didn't. It just hurt me enough to scare me, then it laughed. Dr. Bennett looked up from bandaging Bill's wounds. It laughed? Not like a person laughs. Like something that knows it's the strongest thing around and finds that funny. Jake felt sick to his stomach. This was worse than he had feared. Whatever had escaped from that prison ship was not just a wild animal. It was intelligent, and it was cruel. They brought Bill back to town and set up guards around the settlement. Jake divided his small force to cover as much ground as possible, but he knew it was not enough. 4 security officers and maybe 20. Colonists with hunting rifles could not protect everyone from something that could tear through walls like tissue paper. The second attack came 2 days later at the Miller farm on the north side of the valley. This time the creature was more violent. The farmhouse was completely destroyed, reduced to splinters and rubble. The family had escaped only because their dog had started barking frantically in the middle of the night, giving them time to run. Jake arrived at the scene with Dr. Bennett and 2 officers. The destruction was total. It looked like a tornado had hit the farm, but the damage was too focused, too deliberate. This was not random destruction. This was a message. It's hurting us, Jake said as he studied the wreckage. Look at the pattern. First the Henderson place on the south edge, now the Miller farm on the north. It's driving everyone toward the center of town. Dr. Bennett found strange footprints in the soft earth around the destroyed house. They were huge, with long claw marks that dug deep into the ground. But what worried her most was how the prints were spaced. The creature was not just big and strong. It was incredibly fast. Jake, look at this, she called. These prints are 8 feet apart. That thing can cover ground like nothing I've ever seen. That night, Jake called another meeting at the community center. The building was packed with frightened colonists who had heard about the attacks. Children sat close to their parents while the adults talked in worried whispers. We need to evacuate, said Mrs. Patterson, an elderly woman who had lived through several frontier emergencies. Send out a distress call and get everyone off this planet. The nearest ship is 3 weeks away, Jake replied. And that's if they drop everything and come running. We need to assume we're on our own. Dr. Bennett had been studying the limited information they had recovered from the crashed ship's computer. Most of the data was corrupted, but she had managed to piece together some disturbing details. I found out what we're dealing with, she announced to the room. It's called a Korthak. It was created by an alien race called the Veltar as a living weapon. They're all dead now, but they left behind a few of these creatures. What makes it so dangerous? Asked Tom Miller, whose family had barely escaped the previous night. Everything, Dr. Bennett said grimly. It's incredibly strong and fast. Its hide is tough enough to stop most weapons, but the worst part is its brain. The Korthak can sense hostile intent. It knows when you're planning to attack it before you even move. The room fell silent as people absorbed this information. Finally, Jake spoke up. Then we don't attack it. We defend. We build barriers and try to keep it away from the populated areas. Over the next few days, the colonists worked together to fortify the town center. They moved furniture and equipment to block streets and create choke points. Jake positioned his men at key locations with the best weapons they had. It was not much, but it was something. The creature seemed to enjoy watching their preparations. Colonists reported seeing it at the edge of town, standing just out of rifle range and observing their work. It never came close enough for a clear shot, but its presence was always felt. Red eyes gleaming in the darkness, the sound of claws scraping on stone, the low rumble that might have been laughter. Amy Cooper tried to keep life normal for Danny, despite the growing fear in the settlement. She continued to cook meals and help her son with his reading lessons. Danny seemed less affected by the crisis than the adults. He played with his toy spaceship and asked innocent questions about the big animal that everyone was talking about. "Why is everyone scared of it, Mama?" he asked one evening as Amy tucked him into bed. "Because it's very dangerous, sweetie. It might hurt people." "But why would it want to hurt people? Did someone hurt it first?" Amy did not know how to answer that question. She kissed Danny's forehead and turned out the light, wishing the world was as simple as an 8-year-old's view of it. The third attack came a week after the Miller farm. This time the creature hit the town itself, targeting the grain storage facility on the outskirts of the settlement. The building was destroyed in minutes, and with it went most of the colony's food reserves for the winter. Jake and his men arrived as the creature was finishing its work. They got their first clear look at the Korthak in the light of the burning grain warehouse. It was even more terrifying than Bill Henderson had described. The creature stood on 2 powerful legs that ended in clawed feet. Its body was covered in black scales that seemed to absorb light. Long arms ended in hands that were more like weapons than anything meant for grasping. Its head was wolf-like but larger, with a mouth full of teeth designed for tearing flesh. And its eyes. Those burning red eyes that seemed to look right through a person and find their deepest fears. Jake raised his rifle and took aim, but before he could fire, the creature turned and looked directly at him. In that moment, Jake felt something he had never experienced before. It was as if the Korthak was reading his mind, understanding his intentions before he fully formed them himself. The creature moved a split second before Jake pulled the trigger. The shot missed by inches and the Korthak disappeared into the darkness beyond the burning building. Jake and his men searched for hours but found no trace of it. "It knew," Jake said later as they returned to the security station. "It knew exactly when I was going to shoot." Dr. Bennett nodded grimly. "The computer files mentioned something about enhanced neural pathways. I think it can sense electrical activity in our brains. When we form the intention to attack, it can detect that and react. So how do we fight something that knows what we're going to do before we do it?" "I don't know," she admitted, "but we better figure it out soon. It's getting bolder with each attack." As if to prove her point, a howl echoed across the valley. Closer this time, much closer. The Korthak was no longer content to attack the edges of their settlement. It was coming for the heart of the colony. In the community center, families huddled together and tried to stay brave. Children cried quietly while their parents whispered prayers to whatever gods they believed in. Outside, Jake and his men prepared for a battle they did not know how to win. Danny Cooper sat in the corner of the main hall quietly playing with his toy spaceship. The fear and tension in the room seemed to flow around him without touching him. To his young mind, the approaching creature was not a monster. It was just another animal, bigger and louder than the farm animals he knew, but still just an animal. "Don't worry, little spaceship," he whispered to his toy. "The big animal is probably just lonely. Maybe it needs a friend." His mother overheard and felt her heart break. How could she explain to her innocent son that some things in the universe could not be reasoned with or befriended? How could she tell him that not all animals were good, and that sometimes the only choice was to fight or run? Outside, the Korthak's howl came again. Closer still, the final hunt was about to begin. The final night began with an eerie silence that settled over Haven's Rest like a heavy blanket. No insects chirped in the darkness. No night birds called from the trees. Even the wind had stopped blowing, as if nature itself was holding its breath. Jake stood at the window of the community center, watching the empty streets through reinforced glass. Behind him, nearly 200 colonists had gathered in the large main hall. They had brought sleeping bags, food, and whatever weapons they could find. Families huddled together on the floor while children tried to sleep despite the tension that filled the air. "Any sign of it?" Dr. Bennett asked as she joined Jake at the window. "Nothing yet, but it's out there. I can feel it watching us." The community center was the strongest building in the settlement. built from local stone with thick walls and heavy doors. Jake had positioned his men at all the entrances and windows. They had barricaded the weak points and set up fields of fire to cover the approaches. It was the best defensive position they could manage, but Jake knew it would not be enough. Officer Warren approached with a worried expression. "Captain, we're running low on ammunition. Maybe enough for one good fight if we're lucky." Jake nodded, grimly. They had tried everything over the past weeks. They had set traps using the colony's construction equipment, hoping to crush or trap the creature. The Korthak had avoided every snare as if it could see the future. They had tried using the farming vehicles as weapons, mounting plows and harvesting, blades on the front. The creature had destroyed them all without breaking stride. Most frustrating of all, they had attempted to use the grain silo as a trap. Jake had rigged explosive charges to bring down the massive structure on top of the Korthak. But when the moment came to trigger the explosives, the creature had somehow sensed the plan and moved away just seconds before the blast. "It's like fighting a ghost that can read minds," Pete Warren had said after that failure. And Jake thought, he was right. Dr. Bennett had spent days studying every piece of information they could gather about the Korthak. The creature's abilities seemed almost supernatural. Its scales were harder than military armor. Its speed was beyond anything that should be possible for something so large. Its strength was enormous, capable of tearing through solid steel like cardboard. But the most terrifying aspect was its intelligence. The Korthak did not just react to attacks. It anticipated them. The neural pathways in its brain could detect the electrical patterns that preceded hostile thoughts. When someone decided to shoot, the creature knew before they even began to aim. "There has to be a weakness," Dr. Bennett muttered as she reviewed her notes for the 100th time. "Everything has a weakness." In the corner of the hall, Amy Cooper sat with her back against the wall holding Danny close. The boy had finally fallen asleep, his toy spaceship clutched in his small hands. Amy stroked his hair and tried not to think about what would happen if the creature broke through their defenses. Around them, other families were having quiet conversations. Parents were telling their children stories to keep them calm. Some people were praying. Others were writing letters they hoped someone would find if the worst happened. The mood was that of people facing the end, trying to find dignity and courage in their final hours. Tom Miller sat with his wife and 2 young daughters, holding them tight. His farm had been the second target, and he still had nightmares about the sound of his house being torn apart. "I should have gotten them off planet weeks ago," he whispered to his wife. "Where would we go?" she replied. "This is our home. These are our friends. We stay together no matter what happens." Mrs. Patterson, the oldest resident of the colony, was telling stories to a group of frightened children. She spoke of heroes from old Earth legends, of brave people who faced impossible odds and found ways to win. The children listened with wide eyes, desperate to believe that somehow everything would work out. Jake checked his watch. Nearly midnight. If the creature was going to attack, it would be soon. The Korthak seemed to prefer the darkest hours of the night, when fear was strongest and hope was hardest to maintain. A sound from outside made everyone freeze. It was soft at first, like claws clicking on stone. Then came the scraping noise of something heavy being dragged across the ground. Finally, they heard what they had all been dreading. The low, rumbling laugh that sent chills through every person in the room. "It's here," Jake said quietly. The lights went out. Emergency lighting kicked in a moment later, casting strange shadows throughout the hall. The main power lines had been cut. The creature was not just strong and fast. It was smart, enough to understand human technology and how to disable it. A tremendous crash shook the building as something struck the main doors. The heavy wooden barriers that Jake's men had built groaned under the impact but held. For now. Another crash, this time against the side wall. Dust fell from the ceiling as the stone blocks shifted slightly. The Korthak was testing their defenses, looking for the weakest point. Jake grabbed his radio. "All positions report in." One by one, his officers checked in from their posts around the building. So far, the creature had not tried to break through any of the windows or secondary entrances. It seemed focused on the main doors as if it wanted to make a dramatic entrance. Maybe it wants us to know it's coming, Dr. Bennett suggested. Maybe the fear is part of what it enjoys. Danny stirred in his mother's arms, awakened by the noise. He looked around the dimly lit hall with sleepy eyes, taking in the worried faces of the adults around him. "What's happening, Mama?" he asked in a small voice. "The big animal is here, sweetheart, but we're safe inside. Captain Jake and his friends are protecting us." Danny nodded and seemed to accept this explanation. He looked toward the main doors, where the crashing sounds were getting louder and more frequent. To him, it sounded like a very large dog trying to get inside out of the cold. The doors finally gave way with a sound like thunder. The barricade that Jake's men had built was torn apart in seconds. Heavy furniture and steel beams were tossed aside like toys. Through the gap came the Korthak, and in the emergency lighting it looked even more terrible than anyone had imagined. 12 feet tall and covered in black scales that seemed to absorb light. The creature moved with a fluid grace that was beautiful and horrible at the same time. Its red eyes swept the room, studying the terrified faces of the colonists. Its mouth opened in what might have been a smile, revealing rows of teeth designed for tearing flesh. Jake and his men opened fire immediately. The sound of gunshots filled the hall as they emptied their weapons at the creature. Every shot was perfectly aimed. Every bullet should have found its target. None of them hit. The Korthak moved like liquid shadow, seeming to know exactly where each bullet would be before it was fired. It flowed between the shots with impossible grace, never even coming close to being struck. When the guns fell silent, empty of ammunition, the creature laughed again. The sound echoed off the stone walls and filled everyone's hearts with despair. Jake drew his sidearm and fired his last 6 shots. The Korthak casually stepped aside from each one, then began walking slowly into the hall. It was no longer in a hurry. Its prey was trapped and helpless. Now it could take its time and enjoy the hunt. Dr. Bennett grabbed a medical laser from her emergency kit and aimed it at the creature's eyes. The bright beam struck the Korthak directly in the face, but the energy simply scattered harmlessly off its scales. The creature looked at her with what might have been amusement and continued its slow advance. One by one, the colonists tried everything they had left. Knives and tools were thrown at the creature. A few people tried to charge it with makeshift weapons. Nothing worked. The Korthak was too fast, too strong, too smart. It batted away every attack without effort, seeming to enjoy the desperation of its prey. Parents pulled their children close and turned away, unable to watch as the creature approached. Some people closed their eyes and waited for the end. Others continued to pray, hoping for a miracle that seemed impossible. The Korthak stopped in the center of the hall and raised its great head, breathing deeply as if savoring the scent of fear that filled the air. Its red eyes moved slowly from person to person, deciding where to begin its final feast. Then it looked down and saw Danny Cooper. The boy had slipped away from his mother during the chaos. While the adults were focused on the creature with terror and desperation, Danny had simply stood up and taken a few steps forward. He was looking at the Korthak with the same curious expression he used when examining interesting insects or watching birds in the trees. Amy saw her son standing alone in front of the monster and screamed his name. She started to run toward him, but Jake caught her arm. "Don't move," he whispered urgently. Any sudden movement might trigger it to attack. The Korthak lowered its head and studied the small human child standing before it. For the first time since entering the hall, the creature seemed puzzled. Its red eyes narrowed as if trying to understand something that did not make sense. Danny tilted his head to one side and looked up at the towering creature. He showed no fear, no anger, no desire to run or fight. In his young mind, he was simply meeting a new animal, bigger than any he had seen before, but still just an animal. The Korthak stared down at the small human child, its massive head tilting to one side like a confused predator, trying to understand something that should not exist. For 30 seconds that felt like hours, the creature and the boy simply looked at each other in complete silence. Danny studied the towering beast with the open curiosity that only children possess. He had lived his whole life on a farming colony, where every day brought new animals to meet and understand. To his 8-year-old mind, this was just another animal. Bigger and more unusual than most, but still an animal that could be understood. The Korthak's enhanced neural pathways, designed to detect and counter hostile intent, found nothing to process. The child's brain showed no patterns of aggression, no electromagnetic signatures of fear or anger. There was only curiosity, and something the creature had never encountered before in its engineered existence. Innocence. Amy Cooper stood, frozen in terror, watching her son face the monster that had terrorized their colony for weeks. Every instinct screamed at her to grab Danny and run, but Jake's firm grip on her arm held her back. Any sudden movement now might trigger the creature's hunting instincts. "Danny," she whispered, barely loud enough to be heard. "Come back to Mama." Slowly. But Danny was not listening. He had noticed something about the creature's posture that reminded him of Rex, the colony's guard dog, when Rex was nervous or upset. The Korthak was standing very straight and tense, its great head raised high and its red eyes darting around the room as if looking for threats. "You look scared," Danny said to the creature in the same gentle voice he used to calm frightened animals. "Are all these people making you nervous?" The Korthak's massive body went completely still. In all its years of existence, no living thing had ever suggested that it might be afraid. The concept was so foreign to its nature that its neural pathways struggled to process the idea. Danny took a small step closer to the creature. Around the hall, people gasped in terror, but the boy paid no attention to their fear. He was focused entirely on the Korthak, watching its body language the way his father had taught him to read the moods of farm animals. "My daddy always said that animals act mean when they're scared or hurt," Danny continued in his calm, friendly voice. "Did someone hurt you? Is that why you're so upset?" The Korthak lowered its great head slightly, bringing its burning red eyes level with the child. At this distance, Danny could see that the eyes were not just red but contained swirling patterns of deep crimson and gold. They were actually quite beautiful, he thought. Dr. Bennett watched in amazement as something impossible began to happen. The creature's aggressive posture was changing. Its massive shoulders were relaxing. Its clawed hands, which had been held ready to strike, were slowly unclenching. For the first time since it had escaped from the crashed ship, the Korthak did not look like a killing machine. It looked like a living being that was confused and uncertain. "You're really big," Danny said with genuine admiration. "I bet you're the biggest animal on the whole planet. That must be lonely sometimes." The word lonely seemed to hit the creature like a physical blow. The Korthak had been created as a weapon, designed to be alone, to know only conflict and domination. But somewhere in its engineered brain, buried beneath layers of combat programming, was the core of a living consciousness that could understand what loneliness meant. Jake found himself lowering his empty weapon, unable to believe what he was witnessing. The most dangerous predator in the galaxy was having a conversation with an 8-year-old boy, and the creature was actually listening. Danny noticed that the Korthak's breathing was fast and shallow, like Rex when he was upset during thunderstorms. The boy had learned that the best way to calm nervous animals was to speak softly and move slowly, showing them that he was not a threat. "It's okay," Danny said in the soothing tone he had heard his mother use when he was scared. "Nobody here wants to hurt you. We were just afraid because we didn't understand what you wanted." The creature made a sound deep in its throat that was almost like a whimper. It was a sound no one in the hall could have imagined coming from the mighty Korthak. The beast that had torn through their defenses like paper was making the same sound that lost puppies made when they were looking for their mothers. Amy felt tears running down her cheeks as she watched her innocent son reach out to a monster with pure compassion. She wanted to call him back to safety, but she was beginning to understand that there was no safety anywhere except in Danny's gentle approach. "You know what?" Danny said, as if sharing a secret with a friend. "I think you're just like Rex when there's thunder. Rex gets all scary and growls at everything, but really he just wants someone to tell him everything is going to be okay." The Korthak's great head drooped lower, until it was only a few feet above Danny's level. The boy could see his reflection in the creature's red eyes, and he was surprised to notice that the Korthak seemed to be studying his face just as carefully as he was studying its face. My daddy taught me that animals understand feelings even when they don't understand words, Danny continued. So I'm going to share a good feeling with you, okay? Without any fear or hesitation, Danny smiled. Not the forced smile that adults use when they are trying to hide their worry, but the genuine, pure smile of a child who sees something wonderful in the world. The effect on the Korthak was immediate and profound. The creature's neural pathways, which had been designed to detect threats and plan attacks, suddenly encountered something they had no programming to handle. Pure joy, freely given, with no hidden agenda or hostile intent. The Korthak made another sound, softer this time. It was almost like a sigh of relief from something that had been carrying a heavy burden for too long. There, Danny said with satisfaction. That's better, isn't it? You don't have to be scared anymore. Mrs. Patterson, who had been watching from across the hall, suddenly understood what was happening. Blessed stars, she whispered. The child is taming it. But Danny would not have understood that word. To him, he was not taming anything. He was simply being kind to an animal that seemed sad and confused. It was what any good person should do. The boy reached into his pocket and pulled out his toy spaceship, the small plastic vessel that had been his constant companion throughout the crisis. He held it up so the Korthak could see it. This is my spaceship, Danny explained. I like to pretend I'm flying to different planets and meeting new friends. Would you like to see it? The creature leaned down even further, its massive head now only inches from Danny's small hand. The red eyes focused on the toy with what appeared to be genuine interest. It's not very big, Danny admitted, but it's special because my daddy gave it to me before he went away on a business trip. He said that whenever I felt lonely, I should remember that we're all flying through space together on this big planet, so nobody is ever really alone. The Korthak's breathing began to slow and deepen. The rapid, aggressive panting was being replaced by the steady rhythm of a creature beginning to relax. Danny looked up at the towering beast and made a decision that would change everything. Drawing on every lesson he had learned about dealing with animals, remembering how his father had taught him to establish gentle authority with the farm creatures, the boy spoke in a clear, calm voice. You seem tired, Danny said kindly. Why, don't you sit down and rest for a while? And then, using the simple command that worked with every domestic animal he had ever met, Danny looked directly into the Korthak's burning red eyes and said the word that would become legend throughout the galaxy. Sit. The impossible happened. The Korthak, terror of the stars, destroyer of worlds, the living weapon that had defied armies and laughed at the most advanced military technology in the galaxy, slowly lowered its massive body to the floor. The creature settled into a sitting position like an enormous dog waiting for its next command. Its great head remained level with Danny's, and its red eyes stayed focused on the boy's face with an expression that could only be described as hopeful. The hall remained silent for a long moment as 200 people tried to process what they had just witnessed. Then Mrs. Patterson began to cry. Not from fear this time, but from wonder at the miracle they had all seen. A small human child had done what no weapon could accomplish. With nothing but kindness and innocence, Danny Cooper had reached across the vast gulf between species and found the living heart that beat beneath the Korthak's armored exterior. The age of terror was over. The age of understanding had begun. The silence in the community center stretched on as everyone stared at the impossible sight before them. The Korthak, the most feared creature in the galaxy, sat quietly on the floor, like an enormous pet, waiting for its next instruction. Its burning red eyes remained fixed on Danny's face with an expression that seemed almost eager to please. Danny reached up and gently patted the creature's massive snout, the same way he petted Rex when the dog was being good. The Korthak's scales were warm to the touch and smoother than they looked. The creature made a soft rumbling sound deep in its chest that reminded Danny of a cat purring. See? Danny said to the room full of amazed adults. He's not mean. He was just scared and didn't know how to ask for help. Amy Cooper finally found the courage to move. She walked slowly toward her son, ready to grab him and run if the creature showed any sign of aggression. But the Korthak barely glanced at her. Its attention remained focused entirely on Danny. as if the boy was the most fascinating thing it had ever encountered. "Danny," Amy said softly. "Come to Mama now," very slowly. "It's okay, Mama," Danny replied without taking his eyes off the creature. "He won't hurt anyone. Will you, big guy?" The Korthak tilted its head and made another soft rumbling sound. To everyone's amazement, it seemed to be responding to Danny's question. Dr. Bennett approached carefully, her medical training overcoming her fear as she studied this unprecedented situation. She had read about animal bonding in her studies, but nothing had prepared her for what she was witnessing. "Danny," she said gently, "can you ask your friend to stay sitting while we talk?" Danny looked up at the Korthak and smiled. "You're being such a good boy. Just stay right there while the grown-ups figure things out, okay?" The creature settled more comfortably into its sitting position, crossing its massive arms in front of its chest. It looked remarkably patient, like a well-trained dog waiting for its owner to finish a conversation. Jake approached with his weapon lowered but ready. He had seen many impossible things during his military career, but nothing like this. "Dr. Bennett, what exactly is happening here?" "I think Danny has formed some kind of bond with the creature," she replied, studying the Korthak's relaxed posture. "Remember, I told you that its neural pathways can detect hostile intent." Danny approached with no aggression, no fear, just pure kindness. The creature doesn't know how to process that. Over the next hour, the colonists slowly began to relax, as it became clear that the Korthak posed no immediate threat. The creature remained sitting exactly where Danny had told it to sit, occasionally making soft sounds when the boy spoke to it. Danny treated his new friend like any other animal he had befriended on the colony. He told the Korthak about life on Haven's Rest, describing the farms and the animals and the peaceful routine of colony life. The creature listened with apparent interest, its red eyes following Danny's gestures and its great head nodding slightly as if it understood. "Are you hungry?" Danny asked the Korthak. "Mama always says that mean animals are usually just hungry animals." Amy brought some bread from their emergency supplies, though she was not sure if the creature would eat human food. To everyone's surprise, the Korthak accepted the offering gently, taking the bread in its massive claws without making any threatening moves. Word of the incredible events spread quickly throughout the colony. People who had been hiding in their homes began to venture out, drawn by curiosity and the news that the terror was over. They gathered outside the community center, peering through windows at the remarkable sight inside. Tom Miller was among the first to enter the building, despite his family's protests. His farm had been destroyed by this creature, and he needed to see for himself what had changed. He stopped just inside the door, staring at the Korthak sitting peacefully beside the small boy. "Is it really safe?" Tom asked Jake. "As long as Danny is here, yes." The creature seems completely focused on him. As days passed, an extraordinary routine developed. The Korthak would not leave Danny's side, following the boy everywhere like a devoted pet. When Danny went to school in the temporary classroom set up in the community center, the creature sat outside the window and waited patiently. When Danny played in the yard, the Korthak watched over him like a protective guardian. Dr. Bennett spent hours observing the relationship between boy and beast. She documented everything, knowing that scientists throughout the galaxy would want to study this unprecedented bond. The Korthak showed no aggression toward anyone as long as Danny was present and calm. It seemed to take emotional cues from the child remaining peaceful when Danny was happy and becoming alert only when the boy was upset or tired. "It's like the creature has imprinted on him," Dr. Bennett explained to Jake. "Danny is the first being it ever encountered without hostile intent. In a way, he's become its anchor to a different way of existing. The most remarkable discovery came when Danny decided to teach the Korthak some tricks. Using the same patient methods his father had used to train Rex, Danny began showing the creature simple commands. Sit was already mastered. Within a week, the Korthak had learned stay, come, and even lie down. The sight of the galaxy's most feared predator rolling over to have its belly scratched became one of the colony's daily entertainment. But the real test came when Danny found a long stick and decided to play fetch. He threw the stick across the yard and called out, "Fetch!" The Korthak bounded after the stick with surprising grace for such a large creature. It brought the stick back to Danny and dropped it at his feet, then sat and waited for the next throw. The colonists who witnessed this scene could barely believe their eyes. Word of the tamed Korthak eventually reached the outside galaxy. Ships began arriving at Haven's Rest, carrying scientists, military officials, and curious observers from dozens of worlds. They all came to see the impossible sight of a human child playing with a creature that had terrorized star systems. General Patricia Hayes arrived with a team of xenobiologists and military experts. She had spent years studying reports of Korthak attacks and had come to see if the stories were true. "This changes everything we thought we knew about these creatures," she told Dr. Bennett after observing Danny and the Korthak for several hours. "If one can be domesticated, perhaps they're not the mindless killing machines we believed them to be." Danny was happy to demonstrate his friend's abilities for the visitors. He showed them how the Korthak could sit, stay, fetch, and even perform simple tricks like shaking hands with its massive claws. The creature seemed to enjoy the attention and performed each command with obvious pride. "He's very smart," Danny explained to General Hayes. "He learns new things really fast. I think he was just lonely before and didn't know how to make friends." The general watched as Danny hugged the creature's enormous head, and the Korthak rumbled with contentment. "How did you know to approach it this way?" she asked. Danny shrugged, the way children do when adults ask them to explain something that seems perfectly obvious. "Daddy always said that animals just want to be understood, so I tried to understand him instead of being scared." As months passed, the Korthak became a beloved member of the Haven's Rest community. Children who had once cowered in fear now lined up to pet the gentle giant. The creature seemed to enjoy the attention, though it always returned to Danny's side when called. Scientists studying the bond discovered that the Korthak's brain had actually changed since meeting Danny. The neural pathways dedicated to aggression and combat had begun to weaken, while new connections formed in areas associated with social bonding and cooperation. "It's evolving beyond its original programming," Dr. Bennett reported to the research team. The capacity for companionship was always there, buried beneath the combat conditioning. Danny just awakened it. The story of the boy and the beast spread throughout the galaxy, becoming a legend that parents told their children. It was a tale of how kindness could overcome violence, how innocence could succeed where strength failed, and how sometimes the most powerful force in the universe was simply the willingness to see good in others. Danny never thought of himself as special. To him, he had simply made friends with an animal that needed a friend. He continued to play with his toy spaceship and attend his lessons and help with chores around the colony. The only difference was that now he had a very large, very loyal companion who followed him everywhere and reminded everyone that sometimes the gentlest touch could tame the wildest heart. In the end, the Korthak, who had defied all the galaxy's weapons, was conquered not by force, but by a simple word spoken with love. And in learning to sit, it had found something more valuable than all its fearsome power. It had found a home.